Morning, Mr. Wells. How are you?
Senator, how are you?
Good, thank you. I now welcome Mr. Shannon Wells, representing Cambridge Aerodrome and Airlines of Tasmania. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you give us your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
My name is Shannon Wells. I am the Managing Director of Airlines of Tasmania, also known as Avion. We're also the operator of Cambridge Aerodrome in Hobart. I'm also not speaking on their behalf, however I am a board member of the Regional Aviation Association of Australia and a board member of the Regional Development Association of Tasmania.
Thank you. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Basically what I'd like to say is that I'm happy to correct a couple of, in my opinion, correct a couple of things I think I heard today in the room which I don't agree with, which I'm happy to do during this 50 minutes or so. But however, we are an aviation company based in Cambridge Airport. Cambridge Airport is the first aerodrome in Hobart, built in 1934. I actually brought a photo in today to justify it was Western Junction was the first airport in Tasmania. Cambridge was in
North-South rivalry.
Yes, we won't discuss that. It's Tasmania, of course. And Avion was a company that started with my parents for Airlines of Tasmania in 1978, and we fly general aviation around Tasmania, including tourism, charter, flying, training, and we purchased Cambridge Aerodrome from the Federal Airports Corporation in 1992. It was one of the first airports to be privatised by the Hawke government back in the day. So I bring a bit of a different perspective, some of the noise arrangements there, and I also have seen firsthand as a pilot and an operator how some of these air routes have affected our operations around Tasmania. Cambridge Aerodrome has averaging around 30,000 movements a year. So for those not familiar, Cambridge Aerodrome is located adjacent to Hobart Airport. Hobart Airport was built in 1956. Mainly to cater to the jets coming down. We used to have, Ansett and DC-3s and DC-4s flying into Cambridge. So the new airport was built there. We mainly facilitate fire bombers, Antarctic operations for helicopters, private flying, tourism and flying training. And our main routes, as I mentioned before, we fly into the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, do flights to Maria Island. We operate a regular public transport through the Remote Air Subsidy Scheme to Cape Barren Island, and of course our flying training services there. So I've seen firsthand, I'm a keen observer of airspace around Tasmania. I'm part of the Hobart Airport planning and the community forums there. And yes, we have seen quite a few changes in airspace, in particular over the last 10 years. And I'm happy to comment on any questions directly about that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, so let's go back to the commencement of this whole brouhaha, which is 16, 17 and air services requiring change in regulatory process around flight paths to facilitate separation. That would include traffic that would come from your
correct
facility?
Yes.
And also increased traffic, I would expect, into Hobart itself.
Yeah, I think there's a combination of issues with this one. Is that when I first started flying back in '97 or so, we used to have the 4 or 5 flights a day from Melbourne with Ansett and Qantas coming in. One would leave at 6 o'clock, one would leave at 6:10. It was all very regulated, airfares were expensive, and things changed with deregulation. Low-cost carriers came in, and the airspace got busier. At the same time, we came across new technology. We started getting GPSs, we got radar, all these sort of things there happened, and what Air Services decided to do was start putting in more structured approaches. So rather than flying into Hobart using procedural separation, so basically the air traffic controller physically gave you a descent point, told you to track to a navigation aid, and then a certain distance. It had no radar, it was basically looking out the window and relying on pilot reports. Once you got to a certain point, you turn left or turn right, track around, do an instrument approach and come and land. And that always led to some issues where a pilot might be a mile to the left or a mile to the right, and all the noise wouldn't be put on one certain waypoint, so to speak. Now what you've got is a situation in Fawcett, for example, where a waypoint code, a bay ver, is where every single aircraft flies into with a Latin long on a GPS approach, which is much more accurate than a pilot can fly, and every plane flies into that waypoint there, and then from there does their approaches there. So that was something which Air Services did to do. Now, what that it does is that enables the airspace to be much busier and much more efficient. So 10 years ago, you'd have pilots flying and reporting descending through altitudes manually, relying on procedural separation. You could probably handle, I don't know, let's say 10 movements an hour or something like that, because you have to have greater separation standards for aircraft to enable those planes to come in, because it's basically human error. By putting in these GPS approaches in and GPS arrivals, you can handle more aircraft coming into the airspace at the same time. So it was sort of something which was essential.
So both the equipment on the aircraft, which is allowing or driving more accurate flying, but also the increased capacity requirements of
Yes.
the airport, is driving both of those things.
Correct. It allows more aircraft to come in.
Yeah. A greater utilisation, greater efficiency, and of course, greater frequency.
Greater frequency. So I always use the analogy that it's like a train track. So aircraft start coming in and they meet at one point, and the air traffic control separates them and they come down that train track, but every aircraft goes down that train track, because at the same time you've got aircraft flying out of the airport which program these approaches that they can't, even if the pilot falls asleep, they can't physically touch each other, which was sort of the dilemma of the old procedural separation, which was, still had that human error issue there. So Air Services did greater separation standards, which is necessary because of, the human error issue, whereas these sort of approaches allow the airspace more efficient. However, as I mentioned before, if you're under that flight path, you get everything.
I think we've heard that.
Yes, I believe you have.
Okay.
So we've also been impacted as well. So a great example is, for example, when we fly from Strawn, so we do flights around Tasmania. So we do everything basically which isn't Qantas, Virgin, Royal Flying Doctor Service or Sharp Airlines. We fly to Strawn, Devonport, places like that. So great examples for our flight to Strawn, if it's instrument conditions, we take off from Cambridge, we actually fly east. So Strawn's on the west coast, we actually fly east to join the same air route that the planes flying out of Hobart Airport do. We track 15 miles to the east to sort of get that separation standard, and then we can finally turn west. The same thing as when we come from Strawn. We used to be able to fly direct to Hobart, but now we now have to come in via the Great Lake to meet that train track to come down in. So again, it makes the airspace more efficient, but that's just, it's very limited in that concept.
So you effectively follow the established flight paths.
Correct.
To provide the instrument-based separation from incoming versus outgoing.
Even if it's, I'd say, it's slightly impractical, we still follow those same routes.
Okay. So in that sense, to a certain extent, some of the efficiency arguments that have been thrown up
we're a very small player, but yes, it's
don't necessarily compute in that sense, because while efficiency might be part of the equation, the core element of this is the effectiveness of the separation and utilisation of the airspace, and so safety as well. Number one.
Safety is the thing. I'm certainly not arguing that we should go back to the old system, but we have to conform with that. It does cost us more money, but it does allow the airspace to be more efficient, and we understand that.
Okay. Senator Darmanin.
Thank you. So could, just in the way that you described the flight path, I won't get the technical jargon right.
You're right.
I'm not an aviation expert, but feasibly could that, it could be changed, couldn't it? And still achieve efficiency?
Yeah, I do disagree with the comment mentioned earlier so there's two approaches to the runway 30, or 30, but runway 30, which was the RNAV approach, which heads closer towards Denali, and the RMP approach, which comes in via Primrose Sands. I disagree that they are dependent on each other. So I do believe, and again, I'm not an approach designer, but I see no reason why that initial approach fix, so the start of the approach, could not be moved further east over somewhere, which brings in the aircraft via a waypoint caused over somewhere like Cornelians Marsh. I don't believe that would impact the approach from Denali, because I see no reason, in the experience I have in the airspace, that there'll be two aircraft in that location at the same time. So what I find from my experience is that Melbourne Centre, which controls all the airspace above 1,500 feet over Hobart, they sequence the aircraft coming in from Perth, Adelaide, Royal Flying Doctor Service from Launceston. They all bring them in and they all meet at this waypoint called Bever, which is over Fawcett, and from that point it's one aircraft at a time. Noting that Hobart Airport does not have full-length taxiway, so the plane has to land, turn around and come back, so they have to give a certain number of minutes separation anyway. So I'd find it very unusual that moving that waypoint over, which I'm happy to give you a copy of if you haven't seen it, that waypoint a little bit to the east would impact the Denali approach. And I'm not going to comment on whether the Denali approach is better than the RMP approach. That's up for the community groups behind me, but I'd see no reason why they could not be. There's no reason to move one further to the east because one moves, because you'll barely ever see two planes there at the same time. You just can't. It just can't be. They just can't be on the same approach because they're both coming to land and they'll be too close to each other.
And have you been involved in the consultations that the community groups have?
Yes, I haven't been to the actual community groups in the towns, but I've certainly been involved in the air services briefings online and stuff like that. But I haven't been to the actual briefings in the towns.
Okay. Briefings or consultations?
Consultations, sorry.
Right, okay.
Well, some might say it's briefings behind me, but
Yeah.
one-way consultation.
Consultation and show and tell are two different things.
Yeah. Okay. And what level of daily in and outbound traffic does the aerodrome see, and is it growing?
Cambridge is about 30,000 movements a year. So we were the busiest airport, but Hobart Airport's pipped us last year. But we have around about 30,000 average, and that's mainly flying, training, and general aviation. And we get noise complaints as well for what we do. So we get complaints about aircraft flying over flying training areas, and we fly down to the southwest of Tasmania and we fly over a World Heritage Area. We get complaints about that, which probably should still be in scope, but certainly relevant. I've operated an airport. I've had people complain about helicopters flying out and their prize bull went through a fence because the helicopter scared them, and we get all these sort of complaints all the time, which is still very relevant. Mm-hmm. But not on the scale of what appears to be happening with the flight paths in the Hobart at the moment.
Yeah, okay. So, and how are your noise complaints? Are they handled with Air Services Australia, or do you deal with those?
I can say contact Air Services and it'll sort of disappear into bureaucracy, if I could be as blunt as that. But we try and manage, particularly with flying training. I note that, so we do flying training, we do procedures, which again I'm happy to table. We can do certain areas where we can, so basically we take someone from their first lesson, they go take off out of Cambridge, they fly down to a place called Ralph's Bay, which is around South Arm, Opossum Bay, and we've seen the population climb down there over the years. And they do engine failures and stalls, and it can look a little bit intimidating if you're there and a plane starts falling out of the sky and coming into your. It's the same issue that Moorabbin has, Bankstown, all those airports around Australia like that. And we mitigate our noise as much as we can. We try and limit flights on weekends and things like that. So that's a fairly relative noise. We do actually have established flying training over Denali as well. However, we don't use it because we get a lot of noise complaints when we fly over Denali. But we are actually legally allowed to flying training over Denali, but we choose not to because I guess they complain a bit more. So we use Ralph's Bay a fair bit for our flying training, and we do get complaints from there. We also are required to fly via VFR routes So when we fly down to southwest Tasmania, all our planes have to fly by that little line down there over Tranmere, and we also get complaints that why are you flying over my house, stuff like that. So similar sort of stuff, but a different sort of scale.
So it sounds like you can manage the complaints somewhat by the scale.
A little bit, but they are increasing, that's mainly urbanisation.
Yeah, yeah. And so if the requests on flights out of your airport increases, particularly around training, and you've got the capacity to go elsewhere, then potentially, like, your options are you need to expand to other areas where you're allowed to.
Yeah, I mean, there are limited areas we can go. So, I mean, for the main issue is circuit training. So circuit training was a plane takeoffs, turn around, comes back and lands, does it again. During COVID, for example, when Hobart Airport was basically empty, we thought would be a good citizen and fly over Hobart Airport, and then we got complaints from that side of the airport because people living there were shift workers and they didn't want plane at 11 o'clock in the afternoon. 11 o'clock in the morning. So sometimes you can't win. We can move our planes to Bruny Island and they'll complain. There's limited places we can go, and interested to see there's other comments from, like, Moorabbin, for example, I know has a noise issue, and Parafield I know has a big up in Adelaide has a lot of issues there. So we try our hardest to be a good corporate citizen, but at some stage people need to learn to fly, and there's only so many places they can go.
And that was my other question: is the in terms of training access to fly in Tasmania, is this the main, the only option?
Cambridge is we're the only established flying school. Apart from an aero club in Tasmania, I do think Devonport would be a lovely place to learn to fly because there's not many houses around Devonport. I think it'd be a great place, but that's a bit pipe dreaming. But there's a lot of airports around, like Wynyard, for example, has houses all around it, and that would annoy a lot of people. Launceston's Evandale, there's people there, so there's not really many options in Tasmania.
Yeah, and would the expansion of Hobart Airport have impacts on your operations?
Not necessarily. So we built a new runway about 11 years ago, which is parallel to Hobart Airport. So we actually can land a Cessna 172 and a 737's beside us coming into land at Hobart. So it's very much like the Sydney Airport of the two runways there, where it's very much like the same at Cambridge. So we've got a pretty good working relationship with Air Services, and we can operate pretty well unrestricted.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Dolan. I just want to go back to the separation issue that you talked about with respect to the two flight paths.
Yeah, the two arrivals into Hobart. Yes.
Yeah. So you talked about. Let me see if I can get the lingo right. The RNP versus the RNAV.
Yes.
And so the conversation from the people around Primrose Sands Dodgers Ferry is to move that flight path a few Ks to the east. The concern from the Dunalley community is that by doing that, you move automatically one of the flight paths that impacts on those. You're saying that those things don't necessarily need to be linked or have that level of separation in the way that they're currently designed, because they're the way that the airspace practically works is that there won't be two aircraft there at the same time.
I'm happy to be proven wrong, but that would be my understanding. There are other approaches into Hobart on that runway, for example, a VOR approach or other things like that. I don't see, considering they both start at the same approach fix of Babur, which is over Fawcett. So both approaches start there first. They fly down here, hit that waypoint, and regardless it's the runway, it's the same point. They can go.
So they're going to have, but they both
have to go through Babur.
That waypoint.
Both have to hit there, and that one goes the RMP approach close, and that one goes over. And they're not used for separation purposes. They don't put one plane, they don't bring two planes down there at the same time and have, we'll give one a shortcut and give one the long approach to do the separation. I've not witnessed that. So I would suggest that you could move that waypoint further east, and it would not. But again, I'm not an approach designer. I'm very happy proven wrong, but from my experience, I do not see two aircraft there at the same time. And the only time I'd see two aircraft there would be if one's doing training, for example, which would probably be me, doing training there because there's a holding point there, and they'd just say, "Oh, clearance not available. Go somewhere else. We've got a 737 coming in. Just wait 10 minutes, and then you can go there." I just don't see a reason why there'd be two high-capacity jets there, both doing the approach at the same time, because again, they both got to land. They both end at the same. They both start at the same point. They both end at the same point. I think it was mentioned earlier. There's 6 miles of separation between the two. That's not enough for something flying at 200 knots. It's 30 seconds.
And so in respect of the waypoint itself, so what you've just said is that effectively you could relocate the waypoint to a location that has less population.
Yeah, that waypoint over Fawcett, I just feel it is a point put there. I mean,
and then the tracks would then all
differentiate from
culminate
that. Correct.
into that.
Yeah.
And mitigate the impact of
some noise. There'll still be someone impacted, but there'll be. I mean, the approach, the close approach, is very efficient. I mean, it's been designed to be in my opinion, the closest approach you can do using it's basically it's turning approach.
It's relatively tight.
It's relatively tight.
Yep.
It's and only some people can do it. So my aircraft can't fly it. And the point was raised before that when it was first created, only some operators could do it. Well, during COVID, all the airlines, because a lot of airports around Australia are introducing their sort of approaches. They're not quite as tight as this, but it is more efficient use of the airspace, and so they've increased the equipment on the aircraft and trained their pilots, and now more are doing it. But I think initially only Jetstar were the only airline that could fly it with their Airbuses. And then progressively over the last few years, more and more airlines introduced this equipment and this training to allow them to be approved to do this. But this does require CASA approval to this approach, the tight one, because it is quite tight and you need special training to do it.
And clearly that there's been a significant investment in that process.
Absolutely.
By the airlines. Okay. All right. I think that might do us. Thank you for your evidence. It's been quite useful. Well, is for us, might not be for other people, but we very much appreciate that. We are a little bit ahead of.
Do you mind if I just make one extra comment?
I'm very happy to receive your.
I just want to note the white paper came out a few days ago, and I would suggest it was a little bit disappointing from a general aviation point of view. There wasn't a lot put into it, and I do note that this committee did an inquiry into general aviation a few years ago, and I saw the government's response basically saying, almost thanks but no thanks. We note it's been so. We note the rules were something like. So the comment was something like, we note your recommendations, but the time has been so long since the committee came out that it's noted but not being followed up on.
So you would say that. I mean, we're getting a little bit off track, but
yeah, I know. I understand. I appreciate your time, but
in terms of reference, might say any other matters. So it does give us some scope.
Yeah, it's just a little bit frustrating.
I suppose just to make a quick point, then, in that context, you would see that some of the recommendations that came out of that previous report still have currency.
Paper. Yeah.
No, but they still have currency.
They absolutely have currency, and it's just 12 recommendations and it didn't enter the white paper. I'll leave it on.
So your response to the white paper would be,
wasn't enough for general aviation.
Could you please, not enough for general aviation, but please can you go back and look at that last Senate report, because there's some good recommendations there?
Very good recommendations there.
Okay, well, we'll take that advertisement for the Senate Committee's work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wells. We shall have a quick break for